Learn how to make a large fabric basket that is perfect for storage. Like this video and follow my channel. The items you will need to make your own fabric basket are ribbon, firm fusible interfacing, fusible foam, and 2 yards of canvas. The first thing you will do is cut the fabric to the right size and shape. You will need to decide how big your fabric box will be, but if you imagine it as the center of your box is the bottom and each side will be flat out like a giant plus sign. So you will need to cut out 4 squares or rectangles from each corner. You can see I'm measuring with a ruler and a pen to mark my corners to cut out the piece. I folded my fabric in half, so I will only cut twice, but I will be cutting 4 squares out of the fabric. I like to use friction pens since when they are ironed, they go away. They do come back if you put it in the freezer, so make sure that you mark it in the seam allowance. I'm cutting out my corners, and since there's 2 layers, I am cutting out the 4 squares. After you do 1 layer of fabric, you need to do the exact same thing on your other piece of fabric. I am using a double-sided fusible foam. I chose foam because it keeps the basket soft, but it is better at standing up than using fusible fleece. It's quite squishy and plushy, and both sides can be ironed on to fabric. I'm also using a medium weight fusible interfacing that I found in a 1 yard cut. It wasn't as firm as I would have liked, but I really needed a large piece of interfacing, which is hard to find. Next, you need to cut your interfacing to the right size. So this is the medium weight fusible interfacing that I'm laying on top of my lining canvas fabric. I'm placing it out, and then I will cut out the 4 squares from each corner and have it match with the lining fabric, the piece of fabric that will be the inside of my fabric basket. Next, I'm going to do the same thing with my foam and my canvas fabric that will be the outside of the box. I'm laying the canvas on top of the foam, and I'm going to cut the foam to be the same shape as my canvas outer fabric. Next, I need to fuse the foam to my fabric. So I laid down a silicone sheet, or you can use parchment paper, between the ironing board and the other side of the foam. Then I laid the foam down, and then I laid the fabric, and I'm fusing the fabric to the foam. You really need to have a silicone sheet or parchment paper, or your foam will be fused to your ironing board. Next, I'm going to fuse the interfacing to the inner fabric. I have the fabric down first and then the interfacing on top, and I'm fusing it together. It doesn't matter which order you use. The interfacing only has 1 side that is fusible, so just make sure that that side is facing the fabric. Next, we are going to sew those corners into a 3D shape. So first I'm trimming the interfacing off. There was 1 piece that was in the way. And then I'm going to fold that square. The sides will be together, and I'm lining up that bottom, and then I'm clipping it, and this is going to be the side of my box. So I need to clip all 4 corners of my box, and this is the inner piece my inner part of my box that has the mid-weight fusible interfacing and canvas for the lining. I'm going to do the same thing for the outer edge, but it's a lot stiffer because of the foam. So I'm going to clip those straight edges together, and it definitely becomes a 3D box right away because the foam is so stiff. It's a little tricky to sew through. I decided to have the foam in my seam allowance to help make my seams a little bit stronger than having the foam a smaller shape and having the seams be just slightly weaker because there's no foam in the seam allowance. Next, we're going to sew those edges that we clipped. So this is the outer edge that has foam and canvas, and I'm using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm carefully sewing through, and the camera is going to get covered in spots here and there because the foam it's not stiff, it's very soft, but it's bulky in a way, and so sometimes it jumps up and gets in front of the camera. So I did my very best to keep the camera clear to show you what was going on. Make sure you backstitch at the start and end of each seam. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the lining and the mid-weight interfacing. So I backstitch at each seam, and I'm using a straight stitch and a universal needle, and I'm sewing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance along the side of each box. Now we're going to sew the top edge of the basket. I turned my lining piece right side out and slid it inside of my outer piece so that it's right sides together. And then I clip along the whole top edge and make sure everything lined up. Make sure that your seam allowances are clipped open so that when you sew across those seams, you have open seam allowances and there's less bulk. Now I'm going to sew the top edge of the box together. I'm using a straight stitch, a universal needle, and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Start with a back stitch and then go all the way around the box, going slowly and making sure that those seam allowances stay open. When I get to the end, I'm going to backstitch and leave a 6 to 8 inch hole open so that I can turn the box right side out. Make sure that you backstitched at the beginning and end, or your seam will come undone as you are pulling the box to the right side out. Now that I have sewn the top edge of my box, I'm going to turn it right side out. So I stick my hand in the hole, that 8-inch hole I left on the top, and I'm slowly pulling the fabric to the outside. I'm catching corners and doing my very best to not rip open that seam I just made. That's why you need to backstitch so that it's strong at the ends, the edges of that hole. And I'm slowly going and carefully going to pull all of the fabric right side out. Now I'm going to sew along the top edge of the basket for a nice finished edge, and it will actually close the hole where we turn the basket right side out. I am sewing 3/8 inch away from the top edge of the basket, and I keep using my fingers to roll that lining fabric to the inside of the basket so that when the basket is being used, the top edge will only show the navy side or the outside of the basket. And I chose to show you how to sew this from the top down. Since the basket is so bulky, I could not have a camera nearby because the basket got away. Now I am clipping the hole closed. I'm tucking in those seam allowances, and clipping it closed so that when I sew along that edge, that hole, it will close the edge, the open hole, and it will look, you will not be able to tell that there was an open hole right there because it will be closed with the top stitching. Now we're going to iron that top edge to give it a nice look, and we're going to iron the sides of the basket. Since we used foam that has a double fusible side, as I'm pressing the side, the foam is actually being fused to the lining piece of the basket. It's making it all connected and nice and smooth, so I don't have to quilt the basket since that fusible side of the foam is fusing to both sides of the basket, the inside fabric, the inside lining, and the inside of the outer fabric. So it makes it a lot quicker and easier to just fuse it instead of quilting it. The last thing is optional, but I take a piece of ribbon about 8 inches long and I put it on the side of the basket. I fold the edges under and pin it on, and then I sew a little rectangle around each side to enclose the raw edges and make a nice strong handle for picking the basket up. There's a little bit of stitching on the inside, but that's just fine. I love to use my fabric basket as a hamper or holding blankets next to a couch. It's a great storage item and it's really easy to make. Thank you for watching my video. Please like it and let me know who you would give the basket to in the comments.